Shattered in front of the television cameras, the mother of Carme, 13 years old, pleaded for her daughter's kidnapper to release her safe and sound. Melbourne, Australia, was stunned by the terrible events that began on April 13th of 1991, and that kept increasing in murkiness. Everything indicated that a perverse kidnapper had once again left the city in suspense, a kidnapper who was about to move to the next level. The kidnapping of Carme in her own home and while taking care of her little sisters made the whole community relive the horror they had gone through in 1987, 88 and 1990. An unknown subject lurked in the night and watched families until he found the right moment to attack. The baffled investigators agreed that the aggressor did a hard job of intelligence, spying for a long time on who would become the new recipient of his perversion. Until then, the mysterious criminal had released all the little ones alive after abusing them. But Carmaine wouldn't be so lucky. For a year, the Chan family lived in total uncertainty. In Melbourne, everyone was already locking their doors, and an uncontrollable psychosis had been unleashed by a criminal whose nickname chilled the blood, Mr. Cruel. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Stories about criminals lurking in neighborhoods, selecting the most vulnerable victims, are unfortunately more common than we think. And they highlight a modus operandi common in criminal records around the world. But the case of Mr. Cruel is especially chilling due to the fact that to this date he has not been captured or even identified. There aren't even clear clues to potentially lead to him in the near future. The mystery of Mr. Cruel has been traumatizing all the inhabitants of Australia for over 35 years. Is this killer still alive? Why did he disappear overnight? Who was he really? In this video, we'll discuss that and many other topics. So welcome to the story of Mr. Cruel. When the media began to talk about the kidnapping of Carmaine, the situation seemed unreal. It was inconceivable that for the fourth year, almost consecutively, a man had broken into a family home to subdue a girl. Until 1987, Melbourne seemed to be a quiet and friendly city. It is currently the most populated in Australia, even surpassing the iconic Sydney. In those years, it was a united community that seemed ideal for raising children. When on August 22nd of 1987, in the suburban neighborhood of Lower Plenty, an unknown man broke into a house 16 kilometers from the center. Something began to break forever. According to the journalistic records of that time, everything had started at 4 in the morning, when an intruder armed with a knife and a gun broke the largest window of a home and surprised the sleeping family. The first thing he did was tie up the parents' hands and feet, lock them in a closet, and then he went to the children's room. The house was home to a boy around 8 years old and his 11-year-old sister, according to some media reports. The younger one was tied to the bed, and the girl was abused by the man. It would be the first in a series of cases that seemed to be carbon copies of each other, at least until the last one, where things got worse. After subduing the girl, the aggressor opened the refrigerator, ate some leftovers, took a small sum of money, and calmly walked out the front door of the house. The horrible episode was uneventful for some time. No authority could explain who had been the culprit or why they had chosen that property to perpetrate such an abhorrent act. There was a significant police operation to find the criminal, but no answers. No one was arrested, nor were there any DNA evidence or security cameras at that time that would allow tracking the aggressor. A local newspaper in the city, however, published the headline that would give a name to that horror that was just beginning to take shape. There they dubbed the perpetrator as Mr. Cruel. For a long time, the Melbourne community prayed that it was a horrible exception to their usual tranquility, but unfortunately it was not so. The newspaper girl. 16 months after the first attack, another sound of broken glass interrupted the quiet of the night. It was 5:30 in the morning in Richmond, 19 kilometers from the previous case. The back door of the Wills family home gave way to Mr. Cruel's push. The subject entered with a clear plan. With a knife and a gun, he threatened the parents, tied them up, and left, as in his previous attack to the children's room. 4 sisters were sleeping in the room. Sharon Wills, the oldest at 10, would involuntarily become the protagonist of this second attack. Without further explanation, Mr. Cruel, who according to witnesses had his face covered with a balaclava, gagged Sharon and covered her eyes with a blindfold. Then he took her out of the house. He was taking a second step in his disturbing criminal career. Now he was not attacking the girls inside their homes, but kidnapping them. The situation then escalated. When Sharon's family was able to report to the police, the situation was desperate. The attacker had kidnapped the little girl, and there were no clear traces of where he could have taken her. It was 18 agonizing hours in which finding Sharon alive seemed improbable, but a miracle occurred. A woman reported that they had found the little girl walking alone in the vicinity of Bayswater High School. She appeared to be unharmed, but she had been through an ordeal. As she was able to recount what she had gone through during those long hours of kidnapping, the picture became even more horrifying. Sharon was able to piece together that she had been taken to a house where she had been blindfolded the entire time. At a moment when her attacker was not with her, Sharon was able to spy on her surroundings. Perhaps due to her young age, she didn't fully grasp the severity of what she was seeing, but she described it to the detectives. She was locked in a room and Mr. Cruel had left her on a bed, not far away, pointing directly at the girl. There was a video camera on a tripod. Medical examinations confirmed that Sharon had been sexually abused over those hours. The trimmings of this second attack by Mr. Cruel gave greater projection to his name. Not only was he a ruthless and perverse criminal, but he was also keeping a record of all the aberrations he subjected his victims to. But the question arose again, who was he really? And even more importantly, where was he? And why? Why was he able to disappear, and why was it so hard to catch him? The Sharon Wills case provided further insight into the criminal mind. Meanwhile, detectives were trying to determine how and why Mr. Cruel had chosen her to perpetrate this second attack. They found a newspaper article that had been published on July 7th, 1988, 5 months before the kidnapper burst into their lives. In the Sun newspaper, a huge photo of the Wills family appeared with the title, "Mother Fights Against a Fire." The news in question referred to an extreme situation that the family had faced, when Sharon and her sisters were caught in the middle of a fire due to an electrical fault in the house. The photo showed the girl with her sisters and mother, who held a fire-scorched blanket. The little ones posed on the bunk beds in their room. And this, apparently, unleashed a sick fantasy in Mr. Cruel, a fantasy that a few days later had become reality. Investigators believed at that time and maintain to this day that the criminal saw the image in the newspaper and became obsessed with the girl. From that moment on, in the following months, he planned the kidnapping, studied the situation, and observed the house until he unleashed his nightmarish plan. But, as in the previous case, the investigation didn't progress much further than that. There was no evidence that could identify the kidnapper. It was also impossible to know for certain where they had taken Sharon. Was it his house, an abandoned place, a property he had access to and used exclusively for his sexual attacks? The route was untraceable due to the lack of security cameras or witnesses to provide conclusive data. Sharon had been clear on one aspect. Mr. Cruel spoke in a low and slow tone, and in some strange and perverse way, he was calm and kind as the girl described. The detectives were sure they were dealing with a dangerous psychopath, a psychopath who would attack again. 50 of panic. Throughout all of 1989, there was no report of any case that could be attributed to Mr. Cruel. And for a while, the authorities thought that perhaps that horror had come to an end. But everything changed on July 3rd, 1990 in broad daylight. It was 11:30 in the morning when an intruder kidnapped 13-year-old Nicola Linas from her own home. The modus operandi of the attack seemed similar to Sharon's. And again, desperation took over Melbourne, this time in the suburban area of Canterbury. Before leaving with Nicola, Mr. Creel cut the phone lines and stole valuables from the home. As the desperate hours of the kidnapping went by, the detectives began to think that they were dealing with a thief with extensive experience in that field, who for some reason had decided to start taking more risks and give free rein to his darkest fantasies. They also considered that it was a criminal with a huge ego, deeply meticulous and a great need to control the situation. That's why they believed he took his victims to another place to have total control of what was happening. While all these speculations filled the hours of intense media coverage, Nicola's whereabouts were a desperate mystery. Mr. Cruel didn't release her after 18 hours as he did with Sharon, but subjected the teenager for more than 2 days. After 50 hours of her kidnapping, Nicola was found alive in a power substation in Kew, another suburban neighborhood in the same region. Clearly, Mr. Cruel moved freely through different regions of Melbourne. Nicola shared some details of her kidnapping that added pieces to this disturbing puzzle. She had no idea where her kidnapper had taken her, but she was sure that during her captivity, she had heard the noise of low-flying planes. The 20 detectives investigated the case for months. They began to suspect that Mr. Cruel's house, or at least the base of operations for his crimes, could be in the vicinity of Melbourne Airport. But again, the investigation following Nicola's kidnapping ended in a series of dead ends. Despite the police searching different areas of interest and even conducting house-to-house raids, they could not come to any conclusion. Mr. Cruel remained absolutely unknown and hidden behind that nickname that now seemed too short. How far was he capable of going? They didn't know it, but they were about to find out. The next step. The school was a common link between Nicolas Lina's kidnapping and his final heinous crime. Nicolas attended a school in Melbourne, which Carmaine Chan also attended, the daughter of a couple of Chinese immigrants who had a restaurant in the city center. Many believe that after the kidnapping of Nicolas, Mr. Krell continued to stalk his victim and prowled around the outskirts of the school until he identified his next target, Carmaine. The April 13th, 1991 kidnapping was so similar to the previous ones that describing it seems redundant. Again, he broke into the house armed with a knife and his face covered. Again, he went to the children's room where Carmaine was along with her 2 younger sisters, but she had already been previously selected by the kidnapper. Carmaine's parents were at their restaurant when the kidnapping occurred, but they returned home in desperation after receiving a call from their younger daughters who had been forced to lock themselves in the closet. While Mr. Cruel was tying up Carmaine, the case gained instant notoriety and the coverage became critical of the Australian authorities. How could the kidnappings of girls continue without anyone being able to stop the criminal? Again, the agony of a desperate family begging the kidnapper to let their daughter go filled everything. This time it was in front of the cameras, and Carmaine's mother's plea was so agonizing that it was forever etched in the memory of Australians. But not even that would move this criminal who was about to take another step in his terrible record. And that's how our story comes back to the beginning. The kidnapping of Carmaine was different from all the previous ones for several reasons. In fact, the authorities even doubted whether Mr. Cruel was actually behind the case. Something that caught attention was that the Chan's car had been spray painted. It had various messages that said Asian, drug dealer, pay, and more will come. This line of investigation led the detectives to probe the possibility that Carmaine's kidnapping was linked to a settling of scores or some irregular business on the part of her parents. However, they never found anything unusual in the Chan family's finances to explain their daughter's kidnapping. So all roads seemed to lead back to Mr. Cruel. And perhaps the graffiti on the family car was an attempt by the kidnapper to divert attention towards other hypotheses. In the event that Mr. Cruel was behind everything, Carmaine's fate was uncertain, but at least experience indicated that there were chances of recovering her alive. On this occasion, however, everything would be worse. Weeks turned into months and the police couldn't figure out where the little girl was. As the 1-year anniversary of her kidnapping approached, the most devastating suspicion was confirmed. On April 9, 1992, a man walking his dogs discovered several bullet casings in another Melbourne neighborhood called Thomastown. The frightened walker immediately called the police, and within minutes officers found the body of a teenager, whose particular features matched those of Carmaine. A DNA test confirmed it was her, and another gruesome confirmation came. She had been murdered with several shots to the head and dumped there. About 20 months before, that is, she had been kidnapped for 4 months. What had happened on that occasion? If Mr. Cruel was really behind that kidnapping, why had he taken the step to become a murderer? It was all a sea of doubts that left the entire Melbourne community breathless, who no longer knew what security measures to take against this evil that fell upon them time and time again. But Australia's terror would continue, because the most disturbing thing about Mr. Cruel is that he was never discovered. And to a large extent, this happened because Carmaine's seems to have been the last and fatal act. 37 years of questions. In the months following that last case, the questions were already too many. Were the kidnappings of Sharon, Nicola and Carmaine really the work of the same criminal? Or were there different sexual predators operating in the Melbourne region? Mr. Cruel had inspired a copycat who replicated his kidnapping method but decided to put his own signature on it, adding a murder. Either option seemed desperate. The psychosis was such that the police received 11,000 reports in the months following Carmaine's crime and 30,000 homes were registered. They thoroughly analyzed the sex offender registry and examined all men with a history of such crimes who lived in the vicinity of the victims' homes. But none matched the few clues they had about Mr. Cruel. Although the sudden cessation of attacks following Carmaine's murder may have meant relief for the community, for investigators it was an exceedingly atypical situation. It was not normal for a compulsive criminal to just stop operating like that, nothing more. There are several theories regarding this issue. The first is that Mr. Cruel may have died after 1991 or taken his own life after killing Carmaine. That would provide a logical answer to why his unexpected disappearance. Another option is that he may have moved. That, feeling too exposed, he decided to leave Melbourne or even Australia and move his actions elsewhere. Perhaps to countries with more lenient legislation regarding child abuse. For years, local police tried to cross-reference data with criminal records from other cities and countries to detect similarities with serial killers from different regions. And perhaps identify the distinctive mark of Mr. Cruel. But there were no matches. They also arrested 73 people, but all were released due to lack of evidence. A third theory suggests the killer had police experience. The boldest even dared to speculate that perhaps he was a serving police officer and that this allowed him to keep the investigation at bay. This possibility was reinforced when reanalyzing the cases and determining that Mr. Cruel meticulously cleaned the houses before leaving, erased all his traces, and even bathed Sharon and Nicola before releasing them, to erase any possible trace that could identify him. The girls described that he was very careful when cleaning them. In one case, he gave new clothes to his victim, while in the other, he dressed her in nylon bags. But can such a perverse killer stop kidnapping and killing just like that overnight? For the specialists who studied the case, it's a very illogical possibility. The most plausible thing is that Mr. Cruel continues to operate in the shadows, perhaps no longer kidnapping, but fully involved in the market for conditioned videos starring infants. The information provided by Sharon that he had recorded the entire attack gave investigators the clue that they were always dealing with a fetishist who possibly commercialized the content of his acts. From the early 90s to this day, the unstoppable advance of technology also opened new possibilities for child sexual exploitation networks, which find very secure channels of dissemination to remain anonymous, both on the deep web and on encrypted platforms like Telegram. No one can say for sure, but perhaps behind one of those internet pseudonyms hides the real Mr. Cruel. After all, many years have passed since his abhorrent crimes, but not that many. He was about 20 when the attack started in 1987, entering the realm of speculation. Today in 2024, he could be around 57 years old. How do you catch a criminal who already seemed invisible in the 90s and now has many more tools to disappear? The mystery surrounding Mr. Cruel generated a lot of attraction from true crime fans, but without too many concrete advances in terms of investigation. The file, which bears his name, remains open, and although there are some theories, there is no certainty to this day. It is believed, however, that Carmaine's murder can only be explained in a way that the girl saw the face of her kidnapper. For the investigators, the deeply controlling personality of Mr. Cruel could have been overwhelmed by the possibility that his last victim could identify him. Although it is not 100% certain that the kidnappings of Sharon, Nicola, Carmaine, in addition to the abuse that occurred in 1987, were committed by the same person. Australian police favor that possibility. In fact, they believe that Mr. Cruel could be behind 12 similar cases recorded in different parts of Australia, in a range of years that spans from the 80s and the early 90s. But like everything in this mystery, this seems to be held together with tweezers. The detectives investigating the case for over 3 decades feel they have an outstanding account with society. As they retire, they are tormented by the feeling that Mr. Cruel won the battle. They are also tormented by the possibility that the answer to the entire mystery is right there, in a detail of the case file that until now no one knew how to uncover. Almost 4 decades after the last attack, Melbourne does not forget those women who were young during the active times of Mr. Cruel. They remember firsthand the fear that spread through the city streets. In many cases, they could never overcome it and continue to close doors and windows every night. Do you remember those endless evenings with some of the 3 girls still kidnapped? Their parents slept in their rooms to watch that no intruder came through the window? It's a fear that persists because, above all, no one rules out the latent possibility that one day Mr. Cruel will attack again.